Hello, and welcome to the third lecture in our series on Greek history and civilization. We now begin the main narrative of the Persian Wars. This is the point at which Greek history ceases to be primarily local and becomes for the first time connected with global power. What we are about to examine is not merely a sequence of battles, but the collision between two radically different political worlds, the Greek city-state and the Persian Empire. It is essential to clear away one misconception at once. The Greeks did not set out to fight a civilization-defining war against Asia. There was no grand ideological plan, no conscious defense of Europe against the East. That language belongs to much later ages. The Persian Wars arose out of accidents, miscalculations, local disputes, personal decisions that spiraled beyond anyone's control. The Persians, for their part, were not engaged in some irrational crusade against freedom-loving Greeks. They were doing what successful empires always do, punishing rebellion and securing their borders by eliminating unpredictable neighbours. What makes this episode notable is not that war occurred, but that the Greeks survived it and then remembered it in ways that have shaped Western historical consciousness ever since. Let us begin, though, by clearing away another possible misconception. Take these images together with the cover slide. The photographs you see here come from the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford and the British Museum in London, and the museum at Olympia in Greece. They show Greek and Persian soldiers as the Greeks themselves saw them in the late 6th and early 5th centuries BC. And I should say again, and for the avoidance of doubt, that all images used in these lectures are either photographs taken by me on my various travels or things taken with acknowledgement from Wikipedia and other Creative Commons sources. I say this just in case the copyright trolls are sniffing round again. Back, however, to our main business. Greek art is not neutral, it is polemical. Persian figures are often rendered as exotic, as soft, as overdressed, as faintly ridiculous. Greek writers reinforce this visual language with contemptuous remarks about Persian luxury and effeminacy. This contempt is misleading. You do not conquer and hold the largest empire the world has ever seen with armies of cowards. Persian soldiers were disciplined, they were experienced, they were accustomed to campaigning over enormous distances. They were the product of a military system that had crushed kingdoms far more powerful than any Greek city-state. The difference lay not in courage, but in conditions. Persian warfare developed on the flat plains of Asia. Space mattered here, mobility mattered, of course cavalry mattered. Persian armies were built around archers and horsemen who could wheel and retreat and harass and return. The aim was to wear an enemy down before closing. Persian battle tactics were similar to what you see in the old cowboy and Indian films, both wholly rational given the terrain. Greek warfare developed in a different environment. Mainland Greece is mountainous, it's broken, it's narrow, it rewards solidity over speed, and it rewards cohesion over manoeuvre. The Greek hoplite was a heavy infantryman designed for shock combat at close quarters. He carried roughly 40 pounds of armour, bronze helmet, bronze breastplate, bronze greaves, a heavy wooden shield faced with bronze, and a long thrusting spear of iron. You can see some pictures of Greek military equipment in this slide. Don't forget the helmet. I took those in Athens, in Olympia, and in London. Persian soldiers, by contrast, needed to be light. Their quilted tunics, their trousers, their soft caps, mocked by Greek artists and seen by us as resembling pyjamas, were practical for a mobile style of war. They were not designed to absorb a hoplite charge head-on. The result was simple. Whenever Greeks and Persians met face to face on confined terrain without room for cavalry or missile harassment, the Greeks usually won. This tactical fact would later be inflated into a moral myth. But at the time it was an accident of geography and equipment. Let us move on. This war also marks something else. The birth of history as a literary and intellectual form. At the top of this slide, you see Herodotus of Halicarnassus, a Greek born in Asia Minor, on the very edge of Persian imperial control. Herodotus was not the first person to write about the past. Before him, there were chronicles, many of them, lists of kings, portents, battles, disasters. What Herodotus did was fundamentally different. He selected events, he arranged them, he asked why they happened, then he asked what happened because of them. He tells us exactly what he's doing at the opening sentence of his work. Herodotus of Halicarnassus here displays his inquiry, so that human achievements may not become forgotten in time, and great and marvellous deeds, some displayed by Greeks, some by barbarians, may not be without their glory, and especially to show why the two peoples fought with each other. Yes, why the two peoples fought with each other. That is history, not a chronicle. The final clause is crucial. Herodotus is not interested simply in victory or defeat. He's not interested simply in quaint set-piece battles. He wants to explain how a war between Greeks and Persians came about at all. His method was empirical by the standards of his time. Unlike later historians, he had almost no written sources to consult. Archive research seems to have been a method developed 200 years later by Polybius. Instead, he travelled widely. He questioned everyone he met, Greeks, Persians, Egyptians, Phoenicians, anyone with a story to tell. He compared accounts and noted contradictions. He occasionally admitted ignorance. He was born too late to interview the great commanders of the Persian Wars, but he did speak to ordinary soldiers on both sides, men who had been present at the events he describes. That is why his narrative is so rich in gossipy anecdotes and discussions of personal motive. This is not a weakness. Some of his narrative is unlikely. Sometimes we are able to correct him. Even so, he is truthful, and what he is recording is at least what was believed by men living at the time. All else aside, I do challenge you to open him at random and then to read. How easy is it to close him afterwards? Xerxes probably did have the Hellespont scourged, but whether or not he did, Herodotus makes an unforgettable story of it. Alongside Herodotus on this slide, there are two other images that deserve some attention. One is Darius I, king of Persia. Darius left behind his own account of his rise to power, carved into the rock at Behistun. In it, he presents himself as the chosen instrument of divine order, crushing rebels and restoring stability after chaos. He says, You who shall hereafter see this tablet which I have written, or these sculptures, do not destroy them, but preserve them so long as you live. If you shall behold this inscription or these sculptures, and shall not destroy them, but shall preserve them as long as your line endures, then may Ahura Mazda be your friend, and may your family be numerous. Live long, and may Ahura Mazda make fortunate whatsoever you do. This is propaganda, but it is also history after a kind. It reminds us that Persians had their own historical consciousness. They did not see themselves as villains in a Greek drama. They saw themselves as restorers of order in a violent world. The other image? Oh, that's the Critian boy, an early classical statue from Athens, set up on the Acropolis around 500 BC, thrown down by the Persians, buried, and then recovered by the Germans in the late 19th century. The photograph here I took of a cast in the Cambridge Archaeological Museum. The original statue in Athens is mounted too high to photograph properly, and when I attempted it, the museum attendants tried to intervene. This will be a long lecture, and I'll refrain from telling you how I took magazine-quality pictures of the Hermes of Praxiteles at Olympia, but I do assure you, next time I am there, those Athenian museum attendants will not be so lucky. But this statue matters because it shows us the kind of person who fought the Persian Wars. He is not a hero yet, he is a citizen in preparation. Within a few years, a young man like this might have stood in the line at Marathon or rowed in the fleet at Salamis. The Persian Wars were fought not by abstractions, but by men of this sort, on both sides. And on the matter of men, do look at the list of names given at the top of the slide. You will see these quite often. Darius the Great, King of Persia. Nothing more, I think, needs to be said about him. Artaphernes, the brother of Darius and satrap of Sardis. He's one of the men who started the collision between the Greeks and the Persians. He started it unwittingly, but he is one of the fathers of the Persian War. Aristagoras, the Persian-appointed tyrant of Miletus. I will say more about him later. Cleomenes, joint king of Sparta. Again, I'll say more about him. And then Hippias, the deposed tyrant of Athens. These are names that will come up repeatedly. And look out for Artaphernes and Aristagoras. One is a Persian, one is a Greek. They knew each other. In political terms, they count as friends. Because the names both start with A, it is not difficult to muddle their names up. This slide presents a full timeline of the Persian Wars, stretching from the rise of Persian power in the mid-6th century to the final Greek victories of 479 BC. I recommend you to return to this slide repeatedly. What later generations remembered as a single heroic struggle was experienced by those involved as a series of disconnected crises, separated by years or even decades. The timeline will be useful to see how things unfold and what comes before what and what comes afterwards. In this lecture, we will carry the story only as far as the Battle of Marathon in 490 BC. Even that will take time because nothing about this conflict makes sense unless we understand how Persia came to dominate the Near East in the first place. So let us begin as close to the beginning as we can. Before Persia can become an empire, something else must disappear. For centuries, the Assyrian Empire had been the dominant power of the Near East. It ruled through terror. If you remember what I said in the first lecture about those palace reliefs, the Assyrians used extreme violence as a strategy for expansion and rule. Resistance was punished brutally. Entire populations were uprooted and settled. That is when they weren't massacred. By the late 7th century BC, Assyria collapsed under the weight of its own methods. Terror has its limits. Babylon, the Medes, and others rose against it. The old imperial centre disintegrated, leaving a power vacuum stretching from Anatolia to Mesopotamia. This matters because Persia did not overthrow a stable world, it filled a void. The Near East, into which Persian power expanded, was fragmented. It was ready for a new form of rule, one that would impose order without constant annihilation. And this is the world into which Cyrus was born.